I'm Brittany, this is Shelianne, and welcome to Gaywatch, where we watch gay things. Today, we continue reading Volume 2 of Self-Saving System. Previously on Self-Saving System, we have become aware of some certain salacious versions of what has been happening in the series so far. and Shenjing Cho's response to those being quite oblivious, because of course it is. And that was chapter 9. We are on chapter 10 on page 213. I actually do not know. I haven't checked out the 260s yet to see if there's a reasonable place to stop. There is! Oh my god! So we will be getting through chapters 10 and 11 today. I am currently kind of playing it by ear in terms of when and how often we take a break. It just kind of depends. I do a lot of filming all at once these days, and once I've been sitting for so long, my energy tends to go down. So I just kind of try to head that off at the pass, take a little break, grab some more tea, get the blood flowing and sit back down. And that just kind of happens whenever. Usually I aim for around an hour in, but I'm leaving it flexible on purpose because you can never really know. You can never really tell. So, oh, somebody, and I just realized that I didn't write down who, but you'd be able to see the comment on the previous video in this series. Somebody made the fantastic suggestion, and I feel so bad because I know it was somebody I know. It was a regular, commenter on this channel. It was somebody I know. They made the great suggestion for whenever I come across something and I say, we don't have time to unpack all that, that I should keep track of those. And then as part of a wrap-up stream, a final discussion stream, go through and finally actually unpack everything about whatever moment I was talking about. And it was such a good idea that I'm totally gonna start doing it. Where is a good notepad? Aha, right here. So, whenever I say we don't have time to unpack all that, I am going to write down the page number and the volume, obviously, of whatever we were reading at the time. And then after the stream, I'm going to take a couple notes on exactly what I meant so that I remember by the end of the series. And then at the end of the series, and as part of the general wrap-up video that comes with a series like this, I'll actually unpack it. I'll actually do it. It was such a good idea. I'm so sorry I can't remember who said it, but it's part of a long, beautiful comment that they left on, I'm almost certain, the previous stream. So that is definitely something that I'm trying out. And when I go back and look at who said it, I will thank them on Friday in the next stream. So that's the only real difference that's happening. And you actually may have to remind me to write it down because I'm very ADD, and even when I know and I'm excited to do something, sometimes I forget. I have a bit of a cough at the moment. It's asthmatic. It's not a big deal. And it tends to get better as the stream goes on, but just so you know, there might be a little bit more coughing than what you're used to for this series. I'm actually going to the doctor tomorrow to finally get an inhaler so that it will hopefully go away much sooner rather than much later. If you're familiar with this channel, you know that the asthmatic cough is something I've been battling for like a couple of years now. It's probably about time I get that fixed. So, chapter 10, page 213. Here we go. Let me get my face out of my face. But I can still see you guys. I've jinxed myself. This is why we have water. After escorting the two juniors out of the borderlands, Shen Qingqiu picked a direction opposite to theirs. He'd been walking until the moon was high in the sky when his terrifically keen hearing caught the indistinct peal of demonic bells. "You're exactly like a ghost that won't move on," Shen Qingqiu said without even turning his head. With her presence discovered, Sha Hualing didn't intend to keep hiding, and she confidently strolled into view, coiling red gauzy cloth around her fingers as she laughed. Who taught this distinguished gentleman to make Ling Er so curious? Who took such attentive care of those two? What sort of relationship does your distinguished self have with Sangcheng Mountain? Shen Qingqiu turned around and wagged his finger. "I won't fight you, and you shouldn't try anything with me either." Sha Hualing couldn't do anything to him with her current ability. He was just thinking about scaring her a little when, out of nowhere, his entire body jolted. It felt like a millipede was crawling through his internal organs. That was visceral. A familiar and frightening sensation began to unfurl from the pit of his stomach. Sha Hualing's smile was sinister. "I'm indeed no match for you, but did you think that means I have no way to control you?" For a moment, Shen Qingqiu's legs went soft, but he still managed to stand firmly. He clenched his teeth. "When did you make me eat it?" "How was the food and drink in town today?" Sha Hualing asked coquettishly. "Was the waitress pretty? It's fortunate you ate at all. If you were more devoted in your cultivation, avoiding food and practicing Anidia." Oh, I still haven't looked up that word. You know, speaking of writing down things, Anidia. I'm betting it's Anidia, like I always do, but I need to look it up. Oh, come on. I couldn't get knocked that far, of course. I look away for 2 seconds and I lose it again? Are you serious? There you go. "You would have really given Ling Er a headache." Fuck. In the moment, his entire attention had been comprehensively captured by the Gossip Brigade captain's beautiful and heartfelt performance. Gossip kills. "Do you know what's currently inside your body?" she asked as she circled Shen Qingqiu, overflowing with glee. "This is no ordinary poison." "Shut up! I'm more familiar than you. I've already eaten heavenly demon blood twice. Twice! Normally you eat it once and die once. Who's hit the jackpot as many times as me?" No one was capable of controlling heavenly demon blood other than said blood's owner. As the blood mites were already starting to stir inside Shen Qingqiu's body, that could only mean one thing. Sha Hualing bowed to someone behind Shen Qingqiu. "This subordinate did not feel your trust. I have already captured him." Wait. Aha! Ooh, Shen Qingqiu stiffly turned his head. A rift that looked like dark lightning had split the air and was now slowly sealing back up, and behind him stood a tall and slender silhouette. As Shen Qingqiu turned, he met that stare head on. Luo Binghe was looking down on him from above. Though he had no expression, under those eyes, like twin cold pools, Shen Qingqiu could forget another layer of whiskers. Even a more advanced disguise would have seemed to vanish into nothing. Shen Qingqiu fixed his gaze on him. While indeed cold, the Luo Binghe of the past had been like the reflection of warm sunlight on fresh snow. Even in Jinlan City in the water prison, he had more or less possessed some traces of humanity, some faint expressions, and would lose control and grow angry. But this young man's countenance looked like a landscape of snowy wastes and glaciers that had been frozen for 1,000 years. The sight of him chilled one to the bone. Not the first Frosty... No, the first Frosty Man for MXTX. Despite this, Shen Qingqiu's current state of mind was different from what he'd expected. It was difficult to explain. All sorts of emotions were tangled up in his head, but the single emotion that should have been most prominent was missing. Fear. Maybe it was because he'd failed to avoid Luo Binghe despite all his exhaustive planning, with a series of freak accidents sending him back to square one. Either way, he found himself calm and felt that none of this really mattered. For a split second, Luo Binghe's expression was puzzled, causing his face to appear to soften, just a little. But soon this sliver of softness dissipated without a trace. His pupils contracted, and a red mark flickered at the center of his forehead in a burst of light. Luo Binghe's sleeves hadn't even fluttered when Sha Hualing was abruptly hoisted into the air as if by an incorporeal hand squeezing her throat. She coughed painfully. At the same time, that drop of heavenly demon blood in Shen Qingqiu's internal organs split into thousands of frenzied threads, boring through his insides. Cold sweat soaked his back. "You certainly have some guts," Luo Binghe said breezily. Though his tone was light, anyone could have felt the violent rage concealed beneath the surface. "You have some guts?" Was he saying like the Shen Qingqiu or Sha Hualing? Shen Qingqiu's brain shifted into high gear. Luo Binghe shouldn't have been able to recognize him, even though this current face did somewhat resemble Shen Qingqiu's. With Luo Binghe's observation skills and ability to notice details, he could effortlessly pick out the minute differences, even through a layer of whiskers. But it looked like Luo Binghe had taken him for someone with a similar face. Though that did fuck all for him. Being recognized would indeed have been a disaster, but it turned out that not being recognized wasn't much better. Fuck! Sha Hualing didn't know why Luo Binghe had become so furious, and she struggled while frantically scanning the area through tear-blurred eyes, trying to figure out exactly what had brought on this punishment. When her gaze swept over Shen Qingqiu's face, she suddenly looked like she had seen a ghost. "My lord, forgive me. This subordinate knows her mistake, but this subordinate swears that it was a complete coincidence," she said in a terrified voice. "My lord, forgive me. I honestly didn't do it this time." Inside, Sha Hualing was bitterly grousing nonstop. You see, she had a rap sheet. Ever since joining Luo Binghe's forces, she had watched Luo Binghe spend all his time gazing at Shen Qingqiu's corpse, and managed to more or less guess a couple of unspeakable things. Thinking herself clever, she'd found a person whose face was about similar to Shen Qingqiu's by about 5 parts of 10, then asked a capable demon to perform some minor modifications to make the fake perfectly match the original. One could have called it a work of otherworldly quality. Afterwards, she'd sent the counterfeit to Luo Binghe, and the result, not only had it failed to make Luo Binghe happy, it had sent him into a terrible rage instead. He'd nearly wiped out the entirety of Qiyun Cave in a horrible massacre. Oh shit. Sha Hualing would never forget that, nor did she wish to see that expression of Luo Binghe's again. From then on, she was careful, not daring to touch on anything even slightly related to the subject. Who could have known that the vessel she had settled on this time was also would also coincidentally share some similarities with that fucking Shen Qingqiu's eyes and brows. This was definitely another violation of Luo Binghe's major taboo. "I seem to have previously warned you not to try anything with this face," Luo Binghe said. Strung up in midair, Sha Hualing's face was flushed red from asphyxiation. After a stream of choking noises, she said, pained, "This time, the subordinate truly didn't do it on purpose." Though Shen Qingqiu didn't know the ins and outs of the situation here, he'd pretty much guessed that it was related to this face of his. He shut his mouth, fretting inside. He'd already been dead for 5 years, and just looking at someone with a similar appearance still made Luo Binghe profoundly angry. It looked like he'd really left some severe scars on Luo Binghe's psyche. Suddenly, a sharp pain assaulted Shen Qingqiu's abdomen, like tens of thousands of steel needles were piercing through his organs. This time, no level of bountiful spiritual energy would help him. His vision darkened, and he coughed up a mouthful of blood, red with a hint of black. The air pressure around Luo Binghe had dropped to extreme lows, and his gaze was that of a person looking at something dead. At his waist, Shinmo trembled in excitement while humming unceasingly, as if about to exit its sheath. His hand pressed down on the hilt, and an all-consuming red welled from the depths of his eyes. Shen Qingqiu wiped at the blood by his mouth, a little stupefied by the sight. Logically speaking, after starting the Demon Realm arc, Luo Binghe should have rewired himself into a relatively stable state. Sucking someone dry every month should only have consolidated him further. So why did he have the feeling that Luo Binghe's internal balance had, instead, worsened? It was even more turbulent than when Shen Qingqiu had incidentally helped suppress it after self-detonating. As Xia Hualing was hoisted increasingly higher, she saw Shen Qingqiu cough up blood, and she knew that Luo Binghe had the intent to kill, that he was currently manipulating the heavenly demon blood within the vessel's body. "My lord, you absolutely mustn't kill him," she said, frantic. "Tonight is the full moon, and he'll undeniably be useful. There's no one more suitable than him." She wasn't really concerned about whether Shen Qingqiu lived or died. It was just that if she let Luo Binghe kill this weirdo in a rage, even if his body's demonic chi didn't suddenly surge and cause him to go berserk, his next step would have nothing good in store for her either. As she thought this, Xia Hualing felt that her life was rife with misfortune, and she became even more desperate, shouting herself hoarse. "Even if you don't care about him and don't care about me, think about the one you..." She threw it all out, raising her voice. "Think about the Holy Mausoleum!" Upon hearing those last two words, Luo Binghe's movements slowed. The Holy Mausoleum was the place where past generations of the demon race's ruling class were laid to eternal rest. Other than the current supreme ruler, the miscellaneous remainder of demonkind were, with no exceptions, forbidden from entering, and all violators were killed. Within the Holy Mausoleum, the generations had accumulated various funerary treasures of rare quality in enormous quantity. Talisman charms and spiritual artifacts, stuff that anyone would drool over. Rumor had it within the Holy Mausoleum, there was even a mystical artifact capable of bringing the dead back to life, in defiance of the natural order. With Xia Hualing as his double agent, the original Luo Binghe had successfully climbed to the top of the demon realm and infiltrated the Holy Mausoleum. Everyone knew whose hands those treasures had ended up in. If Xia Hualing was mentioning the Holy Mausoleum now, was she reminding Luo Binghe that he still needed her for something? Whatever it was, she'd obviously found the right angle. On hearing those two words, a somber red still flickered in Luo Binghe's eyes, but Xia Hualing's body suddenly dropped a bit, and the tips of her feet could now touch the ground if she strained. "You managed to remind me." Luo Binghe's fingertips languidly stroked Shin Mo, soothing the restless, agitated sword as he said in a low voice, "True, there's still the Holy Mausoleum." Xia Hualing was about to gasp for breath when she heard Luo Binghe say, "Are you threatening me?" Xia Hualing's soul almost fled her body. The subordinate wouldn't dare. Just tragic. All else aside, she was one of two main female leads of Proud Immortal Demon Way, who'd for years on end ranked in the top 3 of the female character popularity rankings. How had she ended up in this state? Shen Qingqiu hadn't managed to finish lamenting when it felt like someone was pulling on his front and his entire body was abruptly hauled upward. His vision blurred, and in an instant his chest had chilled to the point of freezing. When he looked down, he saw Luo Binghe had pressed one hand against the left side of his chest. The following sensation was like someone had fired a cannon into his chest, the ammunition being pure black demonic chi. Once it entered his body, it spread like an explosion through his limbs and bones via his meridians. The system's jarringly clear, shrill notification made his head throb. "Touch verification successful. Connected to central power source. Storing power. System self-evaluation. All operations normal. Thank you for your continued patronage." Isn't this touch verification a little too advanced? The spiritual energy within Shen Qingqiu had started off as a full reservoir, but after this one brief link, more than half was sucked away. But this depleted state lasted for only an instant. The flesh body formed by the sun moon dew mushroom began to generate a rapid influx of spiritual energy. This influx was then absorbed even more rapidly by Luo Binghe. Shen Qingqiu felt like a mobile power bank. Okay, in my last life, maybe I ranted a little too much in the comments section, he howled internally. But honestly, I only ranted about airplane shooting towards the sky's writing quality and never the male lead, so why is Luo Binghe always picking on me? Luo Binghe made a sound of surprise and withdrew his palm. This body differed from his previous vessels. He'd extracted the majority of its spiritual energy and poured an enormous amount of demonic chi into it, yet it could still rapidly and automatically replenish itself. It seemed that Xia Hualing's single-minded insistence on capturing this person, and all the great trouble she'd gone through to do so, had been justified. With a thump, Xia Hualing fell to the ground in a seated position. She knew that she had been correct to capture this person, and that she'd now survived great calamity and escaped death. Still terrified, she ignored how her knees were trembling and hurriedly corrected her posture to kneel on one knee. "I don't care if you did it or not," said Luo Binghe. "Remember never to let me see him using this face." Xia Hualing hastily bowed her head. "Understood." Luo Binghe casually sliced open a spatial rift and stepped inside. The flippancy with which he left as he pleased was practically infuriating, just up and dumping the two of them in the wastes, like he was altogether unconcerned with whether Shen Qingqiu went or stayed. But true enough, he had no need to be concerned, since Shen Qingqiu had drunk his blood. Wherever he fled, he could never truly escape. With a flick of his fingers, Luo Binghe could appear in front of Shen Qingqiu and leave him mired in excruciating pain. So, does this mean I've become Binghe's lackey? Shen Qingqiu thought. Luo Binghe hadn't recognized him, so if he followed along and did his job properly, maybe his prospects would actually be pretty good. Like hell. Wasn't it just once a month? A couple more rounds of this and he could get used to it. Currently disoriented as he was caught off guard when Xia Hualing moved to claw at his face. Shen Qingqiu blocked her with 2 fingers. "What are you doing?" Xia Hualing clenched her teeth. "Didn't you hear? He said just now that he doesn't want to see your face." Shen Qingqiu stared at her, then reached out and tore a piece of gauzy cloth from her body. "What are you ripping my clothes for?" Xia Hualing shrieked. Shen Qingqiu punched 2 holes into that cloth and covered his face with it, leaving only his eyes exposed. "My clothes are already ragged enough, so I'm borrowing yours. Is clawing faces your only solution to everything? Covering myself with a cloth does the job. Must you resort to disfigurement?" If Luo Binghe hadn't needed to use this person once a month from now on, meaning she had to guarantee his absolute safety, Xia Hualing would have wanted to hack him to pieces. Though if she thought about it more, even if Luo Binghe hated counterfeits, he probably wouldn't have liked seeing this face drenched in blood either, so Xia Hualing could only swallow her anger and yell, "Go!" No issues with that. After all, it would be the same wherever he went, so he figured he might as well take things step by step and observe. By Shen Qingqiu's calculations, after Luo Binghe completely suppressed Shinmo, he probably wouldn't need a vessel anymore. Then it'd be goodbye forever, and that day likely wasn't far off. He just had to be especially careful so Luo Binghe didn't discover that he'd pulled off a great escape using the Sun Moon Dew mushroom. Having adjusted to his new role ridiculously quickly, Shen Qingqiu followed Luo Binghe's lead and stepped into that rift. Xia Hualing was the last to enter, and the opening slowly sealed up behind her. The star employee of the demon race's ability to adjust her mental state wasn't too shabby either. After several deep breaths, Xia Hualing had calmed down and asked, "Your name?" The other side of the rift connected to a long corridor, its 2 walls decorated in hundreds of complicated designs, though the lighting was rather dim. Shen Qingqiu was thinking that this place looked somewhat familiar as he said absent-mindedly, "Peerless cucumber." Xia Hualing muttered, "Peerless cucumber?" and exploded in anger. "Are you mocking me?" The more Shen Qingqiu looked around, the more he felt that even if he'd never been here before, he must have at least heard the description somewhere, and in the process, he fully ignored Xia Hualing. Having received no response, she threatened him angrily. "No matter where you're from, now that you've drunk heavenly demon blood, you henceforth belong to the Lord. If you try to rebel, death and a desecrated corpse will be a kindness." After turning a corner and passing several disciples wearing familiar light yellow robes, Shen Qingqiu was finally certain. This was Huanhua Palace, Luo Binghe's headquarters in the human realm. But this was far too different from the Huanhua Palace he knew. Huanhua Palace was supposed to be resplendent and majestic, dazzling with gold and jade, each plank and stone grand and lavish to the utmost. But the architecture before his eyes could only be described with one word: lifeless. Past generations of palace masters had to a one adored extravagance, and Luo Binghe was no exception. It was just that his love was for extravagant darkness. Even the 2 rows of oil lamps lighting the corridor seemed on the verge of flickering out. In the blink of an eye, Xia Hualing had changed into the apparel of a Huanhua Palace disciple. When deliberately suppressing her demonic chi, she looked just like any ordinary, beautiful human girl. Luo Binghe passed through hall after hall like he was in a fugue before he sat down in the main palace hall. Shen Qingqiu had wanted to go for a stroll elsewhere, but Xia Hualing grabbed him. "Where are you going? Don't wander around. Follow me." Shen Qingqiu didn't want to clash with her, so he could only line up beside her on the side of the main hall, back perfectly straight. Immediately thereafter, some disciples entered to make their reports. Several paid their respects to the throne, reverently relaying information. At first, Shen Qingqiu listened without paying attention, but suddenly he heard a name that jabbed him like a needle. "Palace Master," a disciple said. "During the time you were gone, that Luo Binghe came twice more. When he was unable to find you, he demolished Linghua Domain." As Shen Qingqiu listened to this, his chest tightened, his gums aching slightly. If Luo Binghe had done such a thing, surely he isn't taking revenge for my sake, right? The lack of concern on Luo Binghe's face said, "Whatever, my important self has plenty of money. Let him demolish what he likes. Anything else?" The disciple glanced at him, wiped at his cold sweat, and spoke his next words with excessive carefulness. "One more thing. The little palace mistress wants to see you." Shen Qingqiu's first thought was that Luo Binghe was about to summon his beloved concubine to the hall with a doting expression on his face, but to his surprise, Luo Binghe remained frosty and indifferent, as if even speaking would be too much. He wearily waved his hand, implying rejection. "But," the disciple said awkwardly, "but I'm already here." The mere sound of this voice made Shen Qingqiu's teeth and body ache. Before he knew it, the little palace mistress had already stormily charged into the hall, her presence as forceful as spitting flames. Following alongside her was a comely, slightly older woman in a light yellow robe. Her eyes were hazy, as if on the verge of tears. It was Qin Wanrui. Shen Qingqiu did a subtle double-take, a little surprised. At this time, these 2 maidens should still have been blossoming flowers in their prime, but when he looked at them, there was a clear impression of haggardness. The little palace mistress was especially afflicted. Those 2 splotches of uneven crimson on her face were probably due to a rushed application of cosmetics. No matter how he looked at her, she had not even the slightest bit of a well-pampered mistress's radiant glee. The little palace mistress lifted her chin, looking straight at Luo Binghe. "You've returned." Luo Binghe glanced at her and didn't say anything. "Little palace mistress, let's go back," Qin Wanrui said quietly. "Do you imagine I don't know who you think of day and night?" the little palace mistress asked caustically. "The reason you endure humiliation and remain by my side, exhaustively thinking and scheming, isn't it all to lay eyes on him again? So why are you retreating now that you finally see him, acting all fragile and pitiful? Why not try to stop me before we got here, instead of only attempting to dissuade me now?" Head lowered, Qin Wanrui dared not speak. Her ears flushed. The little palace mistress clicked her tongue, directing it to the hall. "Have you found Daddy?" she asked. "The old palace master has gone into traveling seclusion," Luo Binghe said. "No one has seen a trace of him." This was an incredibly egregious example of a stock insincere answer. As far as Shen Qingqiu understood it, and this went for various dramas and novels, it was widely accepted that anyone on the throne who said this line was the main culprit who had caused no one to see a trace of the previous leader. The little palace mistress laughed harshly. That line again. Would you have to expend too much energy to even think up a new excuse for me? All right, I won't talk about Daddy. I'll just talk about myself. If I didn't come find you, would you ever come to see me? She asked shrilly. How dare you imply Luo Binghe is the kind of scoundrel who recklessly wastes resources, who tosses his women aside without sleeping with them? Don't insult his dignity as a top-shelf stallion novel male lead. We're going to sit with that one for a sec. Ooh. Who tosses his woman aside without sleeping them. Don't insult his dignity as a top-shelf stallion novel male lead. Okay, okay. Oh. Too bad Luo Binghe plainly didn't care to preserve that dignity. Several Huan palace disciples appeared in the palace hall. Shen Qingqiu assumed they were going to console the little palace mistress, but in actuality they forcibly grabbed her and dragged her off. On the way, she screamed and yelled. Qin Huanyue followed alongside her, but sometimes she shot tearful glances at Luo Binghe out of the corner of her eye, as if hoping for something. Before this point, Xia Hualing had been staring straight ahead, her posture perfectly upright, but now she wrinkled her brow and followed them out, standing in the corridor to berate them. What have you lot been doing? You were asked to keep an eye on her, and this is how you do it? Shen Qingqiu had always maintained a respectful distance when it came to the fights between female characters, but having observed this, he felt like the gap between his expectations and reality was too great to ignore. He hurried out after them, continuing to observe. I'm sorry, I neglected my duties, Qin Huanyue said while holding back tears. I didn't stop the little palace mistress. Xia Hualing swiftly cut her off. It wasn't entirely your fault. I've heard that saving face is especially important to human realm women, but even though you failed to seduce the Lord many times, you shamelessly refused to leave. So that's all your face amounts to. Moreover, not leaving is one thing, but you can't even keep a proper eye on a single person. You're her shiji, so her cultivation is inferior to yours, yet you didn't stop her, and you even let her throw a tantrum before the Lord. Who are you humiliating yourself and acting pitiful for? Listening to Xia Hualing point out her inadequacies to her face, Qin Huanyue wanted to die of shame and resentment. Even in the original work, Xia Hualing had deeply hated Qin Huanyue and always found fault with her. It seemed that though they hadn't entered the harem together this time, their relationship hadn't improved in the slightest. Xia Hualing then turned her head and swapped out her entire expression. She spoke to the little palace mistress while full of smiles. These past few years, the little palace mistress has lived a life of luxury, just like she did before. Other than the occasional house arrest, you've suffered no real mistreatment, right? So why are you so aggrieved? Who the hell are you? The little palace mistress asked viciously. How dare you, an indecent vixen seductress from heavens knows where, speak like that to me in Huan Palace? How is the way he treats me any different from a kept pig? Xia Hualing pouted. Then why doesn't the little palace mistress tell me? What else can she do other than eat and sleep like the animal she brought up? Qin Huanyue sobbed. Little palace mistress, let's go. Everything has long since changed. On what grounds can you make me leave? The little palace mistress said hysterically. This is my Huan Palace. Mine! Get out of my way, traitors, the lot of you! The scene fell into complete chaos, with people sent flying every which way. Shen Qingqiu had discovered a most shocking truth. He carefully counted on his fingers. Xia Hualing was made not a wife, but a subordinate. Toils to death on overtime, and her pay and benefits are nothing to write home about. From her boss's attitude, doesn't look like he wants an office romance either. X. Lu Mingyun didn't even exchange the sword tassel love token. X. Ning Ying Ying, after puberty, stopped demonstrating the fanatical love from her naive youth toward the male lead. Seems like her lovesick brain's been cured. X. The little palace mistress, bitter locked-up woman. She herself said that Luo Binghe treats her like a kept pig. X. Qin Huanyue, bitter locked-up woman, the sequel, failed at offering herself countless times. Moonlights as little palace mistress's nanny. X. Chu Hai Tang. After dragging Shen Qingzhou down, she's supposed to be happily going down to Cucktown with Luo Binghe. Why is she still wandering about like a vagrant? X. The 3 Taoist nuns. A second in the spotlight, hello and goodbye. XXX. Looking down this list, Luo Binghe had really ended up in an awful state. He gets this close. As the hale and hearty male lead of a stallion novel, are you doing okay or not? A perfectly good harem had been broken down to the point that it was coughing up smoke. If this were a novel and the plot had unfolded to this point without the protagonist collecting a single wife, what satisfaction points were there to be had? Shen Qingzhou promptly called up the system to check the various categories' point values. Unexpectedly, he discovered that, beneath the B points, the protagonist's satisfaction points not only hadn't decreased, they had actually risen to over 900. Because many of the points had been added while the system was offline and hibernating, he hadn't received the notifications. Shen Qingzhou prodded open the many new windows, providing detailed calculations that he'd unknowingly received. Lined up within them were a bunch of new records. Didn't I say something like this? Like, oh dear God, what if it's been keeping track all this time? He just didn't know about it, and which would make him acting like he just got off scot-free probably a bad thing. Didn't I say this? I feel like I said this. Oh, okay. Ning Ying Ying subverted the trope of a female character being a brainless martyr for love. B points plus 100. Ming Fan subverted the trope of a side character being an illogical idiot. B points plus 50. Lu Mingyan subverted the trope of a female character being a nonsensical martyr for love. B points plus 150. The ubiquitous love martyr female character is an idiot cannon fodder. These 2 points together constituted the classic landmine elements of stallion novels. The unbelievable cojones on MXTX. Because it so overwhelmingly feels like, well, okay, it feels like a couple of different things. She's like correcting all of the, shitty, lazy tropes in stallion novels and subverting them, and then crediting herself for subverting them, which is fucking queen shit, okay? But then also it's like, she's kind of implying that the only way to fix a stallion novel is to make it danmei. Which might be, like, the funniest thing any author has ever tried to say, frankly. Like, the nerve, the absolute... Like, it's too funny. It's too funny. It's a little bit hilarious. And she's in high school, okay? This is the first thing that she published online, right? And she's a teenager in high school. She has opinions about certain genres, and she is unafraid to intricately display those opinions embedded within her work. Amazing. Just simply amazing. I could never. Who could? Frankly, who else could get away with this? I could fucking never. I'd kind of love to, but I could never. I could never. I don't even think there's a genre that I dislike enough to go to the lengths to do what MXTX is doing. I guess, like, maybe, okay, I might be lying. I guess maybe if I were to do anything even remotely like this, it would be with bad straight romance versus good queer romance. I can see me wanting to do that. But I don't see how you get out on the other end of that not getting skewered to death by... Well, you wouldn't... No, this is the loophole. I'm sorry, this is a total tangent. I guess you would get away with it because all the Stallion novel readers won't read this. They won't be reading this. Similarly, all of the readers of, bad het romance wouldn't be reading a fucking queer romance, right? I mean, the crossover is pretty slim. Actually, you know what I would go after even harder than just your typical bad het romance? I would go after the fucking bad boy romances, the Colleen Hoovers of the world. That would be, yeah. If I had written this, that would have been what I would have done. Yeah. This is deeply satisfying. Pardon. Anyway, where the hell was I? I'll just start over at the top of the paragraph. The ubiquitous love martyr female characters and idiot cannon fodder. These 2 points together constituted the classic landmine elements of Stallion novels. Now the female characters weren't relationship-based martyrs for the male lead, and the side characters' EQs and IQs had also risen, so naturally the B points had risen too. This, Shen Qingqiu understood. But while Luo Binghe hadn't betted a single girl, the system hadn't deducted any of his satisfaction points. That part was unscientific. Could it be that currently the male lead's satisfaction points were no longer bound to the male lead himself? Or to say it another way, what determined the male lead's satisfaction no longer lay in such pleasures? Could it be... Shen Qingqiu couldn't resist the urge to raise his eyes and take in Luo Binghe's dismal expression. He suddenly felt that he couldn't stare straight at him anymore. It was criminal. Criminal. Could it be that he'd raised an otherwise totally fine Stallion novel male lead to be asexual? At this point, it's the running joke, right? We have surpassed believability a bit in terms of one's ignorance as far as we know. Now it's just a rim shot. Now it's just a but-um-tis. You know what I'm saying? Whew. Shen Qingqiu closed the windows, his feelings complicated. Then he realized that something about his location didn't quite seem right. Just now, he'd definitely been in Huan Palace, minding his own business, so how had he ended up walking into a forested grove without noticing? And regardless of how he studied it, it was a strikingly familiar-looking bamboo forest. The bamboo forest rustled as a gentle breeze blew through it. Shen Qingqiu didn't even need to guess the identity of the location. Even if he'd been shown only a corner of this place, he'd know where he was. Sangcheng Mountain, Qingjing Peak. How could he not be familiar with the place where he'd thus far holed up for the longest period of time in his life? Your current location, the land of Luo Binghe's dream realm. When Luo Binghe's consciousness was unstable and its fluctuations were especially large, outsiders were often affected, sucked into a dream realm that was as vast as a deep-sea vortex, Or, you could say, they became collateral damage for Luo Binghe's incomparably huge black hole of an imagination. For a specific example, please see the beginning of the Meng Mo instance from way back when. Shen Qingqiu had run through the Meng Mo scenario with Luo Binghe at that time. This was operating on the same principle as strangers the first time but familiar the second. It was similar to how, after connecting to a Wi-Fi network once, the second time you would connect automatically without needing to enter the password. Good analogy. That's a good analogy. Sorry, that was just effortlessly explains the concept, a fantasy concept in modern terms. Very easily understandable. Shen Qingqiu quickly touched his own face and found no beard. Within the dream realm, he'd returned to his original appearance, leaving him with absolutely no sense of security. Just as he was thinking of finding a place to hide and wait for Luo Binghe to awaken by himself, some disciples walked toward him in 2s and 3s, and Shen Qingqiu jerked to a halt, wholly forgetting to conceal himself. The problem was that although the expressions on these coming and going disciples were slightly wooden, every single one had noses and eyes, their facial features complete. Shen Qingqiu could even name quite a few. Not even Meng Mo was able to simultaneously support a vast barrier while guaranteeing the facial features of the life forms within. Yet Luo Binghe could already do it, and to such a great level of detail. Oh, okay. If there's bare minimum one, if there's at least one extra story that we're getting, it is going to be Dream Realm hijinks. I don't really know of what flavor. I have a guess, but there is no way this woman is not giving us a bunch of side stories without fucking with this. There's no way. There's no way. Though Shen Qingqiu had long known that Luo Binghe's OP-ness could eclipse the heavens, he still couldn't help but let out a sigh. Amazing. After exiting the little bamboo forest, he came upon Qingjing's bamboo house. Between the scattered stalks of bamboo, some tall and some short, spring water flowed in a rush, tinkling rhythmically and reflecting the sunlight in a rainbow of colors. Shen Qingqiu was worried that Luo Binghe was inside the house and halted his steps. Having strolled this bamboo forest countless times while idling about, he easily found a place to hide and came to a stop within the shadows. Suddenly there came the sound of footsteps on fallen leaves, and from within the overlapping verdant bamboo out walked a youth in white, 15 or 16 years of age. This youth's skin was fair, and he appeared to have run all the way here. A layer of sweat covered his forehead while his cheeks were rosy, which made for an incredibly adorable sight. The lines of his eyes and brows were precise without being sharp, and they radiated a sense of youthful inexperience. Shen Qingqiu mourned despite himself. It had been a long time since he'd seen the youthful Luo Binghe, that small, refreshing sun. While cultivating on Qingjing Peak, Luo Binghe had liked to wear white. But after his rebellious phase began, the devil incarnate Luo Binghe had come to wear only black, pretty much the polar opposite of before. This youthful tenderness was even more a memory, and it was no longer in evidence at all. Luo Binghe strode forward, calling out in high spirits, "She's in!" Shen Qingqiu was hidden in the shadows, so naturally this call wasn't for him. He turned his gaze, and as expected, he saw a form in teal robes standing at the far end of the cobblestone path. The Shen Qingqiu, forged from memories in the dream realm, stood in the midst of a stretch of verdant, flourishing bamboo. His figure was slender, like unto a thin stalk of bamboo himself, and his expression was unperturbed, radiating the cool aura of an immortal, while his poise was veritably somewhat otherworldly. As a bystander, the current Shen Qingqiu judged him from head to toe and still had to applaud. To be able to fake it to this level, he was really too superb. Also, that Luo Binghe could perfectly restore all these tiny details, as expected of the man who would personally succeed Meng Mo. Then Shen Qingqiu, in the midst of the bamboo, appeared to have been lost in thought. He cocked his head and asked, "Finished running?" Luo Binghe nodded. 10 laps. All finished. Shenxing finally remembered what slice of memory this was. The 10 laps Luo Binghe spoke of referred to 10 laps around the fence encircling Qingjing Peak. Shenxing had personally assigned him this task. He hadn't done it because he had a twisted hobby of inflicting corporal punishment upon a great male lead, but because he just couldn't endure it any longer. After taking over Luo Binghe's education, he'd mulled it over and decided that since he was to be a role model and worthy teacher, he ought to at least do some proper teaching. This way, after they fell out in the future, he would be able to utter the phrase, "Within a master-disciple relationship lies the grace of knowledge passed down," without reddening from shame before the words left his mouth. In his course curriculum, the first thing to correct was the absolute mess that was Luo Binghe's footwork and form. As for the results, he'd mentioned it a while back. The most significant outcome was that Luo Binghe had repeatedly fallen into his arms for half a month. "Once more," said Shenxing. "If you get it wrong again this time, it won't be only 10 laps. Luo Binghe repeatedly... Why does that feel familiar? Why does that sound familiar? Repeatedly falling into Shenxing arms. That rings a bell. That rings a really strong bell. Did that happen? Right? They did mention it before, right? Okay, not going crazy. Yeah. They have mentioned a similar visual, right? Yeah. Cool. Luo Binghe obediently performed the maneuver once more. While he certainly didn't fall into Shenxing arms this time, instead his legs buckled and he ended up directly embracing Shenxing waist. Shenxing was silent. "Shizun, this disciple is useless," Luo Binghe said bashfully. "After 10 laps, my legs have no strength." Shenxing sighed. "I'm sorry, I can't help but get a certain get a certain extra story from Moto Zushi out of my head right now. And I keep waiting for it to take that turn. I just do. We're in a dream place, you know, where nothing's really happening, so Shenxing sighed. "This disciple knows," Luo Binghe said, fully aware. 20 laps. "What laps? Go back and rest." Shenxing had no interest in abusing children. At that time, he'd truly given up. Let him do whatever he wants. No more teaching. There's no sense of accomplishment whatsoever. I'm throwing out the textbooks. Luo Binghe failed to realize that he'd been declared a hopeless case. "Thank you, Shizun," he said in high spirits. "This disciple will absolutely make up the 20 laps tomorrow. Is there anything Shizun would like to eat tonight?" To the side, Shenxing rubbed his forehead. Luo Binghe in those days had genuinely been naive and sweet to an exceptional degree. Enduring labor, resentment, beatings, and verbal abuse, being stepped on, kicked, and made to cook. Of course Shenxing hadn't done most of those things. After watching this artificial master-disciple pair, one tall and one short, walk off while conversing, Shenxing came out of his hiding place and lapsed into bewilderment. Within the dream realm barrier Luo Binghe had constructed for himself, he would naturally choose to relive only his most wonderful memories. If any memories of Qingjing Peak could occupy such a niche, they should have been the ones related to Ning Ying Ying. So why had this one played out? You know, okay, why had this one played out? You know what? From now on, it's getting the same treatment as I don't know whether to laugh or cry. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I feel like I should be taking tallies. I feel like I should be taking tally marks about this. I really, really do. I wish, man, yeah, on any rereads, that's what I'll be doing. The dream realm precisely reflected the truth of a person's heart. It would neither lie nor deceive. Within Shenxing welled up a thought he'd never had before. This thought was admittedly a bit shameless, but probably Maybe. Possibly. Those memories of this master-disciple relationship occupied a better place in Luo Binghe's heart than Shen Qingqiu had thought. Baby steps! We're a little bit closer. At the very least, it could be said he'd given Luo Binghe a couple of moments that were decent enough to look back on, so perhaps the entire thing hadn't been completely unbearable. However, was Luo Binghe a bit of a masochist? Shen Qingqiu didn't want to badmouth him, but normally a memory about being punished with 10 or 20 laps could never have anything to do with the word wonderful, right? Suddenly, a trace of chilly air unfurled over Shen Qingqiu's nape, as if a gaze both hot and cold was crawling upward along his back. He unconsciously looked behind him. Luo Binghe, clothed in black, was leaning against a stalk of bamboo and staring straight at him. The two of them stared at each other without speaking. In the flesh? In the flesh! Shen Qingqiu's initial reflex wasn't to make a break for it, but to remain in place, unmoving, and adjust his expression to be as natural as possible. This wasn't because he was scared stiff with legs too weak to run, more that he'd long since psychologically prepared himself to encounter this kind of scenario. Running couldn't solve the problem at all. This barrier was Luo Binghe's home field, so he could run as fast as he could, and it'd still be pointless. That gaze being simultaneously hot and cold hadn't been his imagination, nor was it a mistaken description. Luo Binghe's expression really did seem like both ice and fire, a deep chill within, as well as a burning heat. The two temperatures combined bizarrely and condensed within his eyes, which were locked securely on Shen Qingqiu's form. Shen Qingqiu braced himself, letting their eyes meet. After a long while, Luo Binghe sighed first. He murmured, "Being able to dream is also a wonderful thing." When Shen Qingqiu heard this, he realized that he'd managed to get away with his risky maneuver. I think I just hit the mic. By summoning his courage, he'd actually won the gamble. At this moment, Luo Binghe's absent-mindedness had enabled Shen Qingqiu to be taken as a dream realm creation. Shen Qingqiu studied Luo Binghe leaning against the bamboo, stare fixed on himself. He thought of Luo Binghe's numb appearance on the throne earlier that day, all alone, when he compared that to the scene in the original work of Luo Binghe surrounded by splendid luxuries, his every call answered by hundreds. Shen Qingqiu's heart throbbed a bit, though he tried to stop it. Luo Binghe didn't have a single wife by his side to heal his injuries, to pamper and ask after him. How could his heart not throb? A perfectly fine stallion novel male lead had fallen to such a state. What man could bear to look? "Shizun, won't you speak with me a little?" Luo Binghe asked. At this moment, Shen Qingqiu's heart was full of sympathy for Luo Binghe. "All right," he said amicably. "What do you want to talk about?" When he spoke, Luo Binghe unexpectedly went rigid, then straightened at once and left the bamboo stalk, the expression on his face one of slight disbelief. Oh no, Shen Qingqiu thought. Was something amiss in the reaction I came up with? But since he'd already started acting, he had to act until the end. He absolutely couldn't give up halfway. Embarrassment was a small thing, blowing his cover was not. Shen Qingqiu smiled. "Didn't you ask this master to speak with you?" He used the tone he'd often deployed in the past when interacting with Luo Binghe. The corner of Luo Binghe's mouth twitched, and he unhurriedly walked toward him. Shen Qingqiu kept his expression steady while casually and gently opening and closing the folding fan in his hand, using the small movements to alleviate his anxiety. Luo Binghe was silent for a moment. In the past, Shizun wouldn't even glance my way, and would walk off without paying me heed, forget about talking to me. Perhaps my imagination today is a little too indulgent. Shen Qingqiu's heart stirred. Though he felt that something was off, these words really did sound a tad pitiful. Could it be that within Luo Binghe's mind, Shen Qingqiu always treated him with indifference, and was lofty and unfeeling? Luo Binghe really did have slight masochistic tendencies, huh? As Shen Qingqiu thought this, in his distraction, his hand unconsciously began to move, and in accordance with the natural order, he patted the top of Luo Binghe's head. He'd performed this action countless times. The saying went that it was forbidden to touch men's heads and women's waists, but the more something was forbidden, the more he felt the urge to do it. Shen Qingqiu especially loved patting people's heads. Unfortunately, as a grown adult, he couldn't often indulge this sort of rude impulse, and moreover, no one would let him touch them however he wanted. Luckily, the Luo Binghe of the past hadn't minded when Shen Qingqiu placed his hands on his head, so Shen Qingqiu had aimlessly patted him whenever, until it had eventually become a habit. And now he was doing it again. He had barely patted Luo Binghe 2 or 3 times when he was caught off guard. Luo Binghe lifted his own arm, his right hand grasping Shen Qingqiu's left wrist. We all know how I feel about a wrist grab. Nobody fucking move. Nobody move. In fact, okay. All right. My spidey senses are tingling. Okay. Shen Qingqiu's expression stiffened as he thought, "Isn't this a bit too close?" Straight after, his right wrist had been firmly captured as well. Lifting his head in shock, Shen Qingqiu felt his vision blur. Something like a feather delicately brushed his cheek. From on top of his lips came a foreign sensation. Soft and slightly cool. In this way, his eyes opened wide, and he met gazes with Luo Binghe's pair of pitch-black irises. His throat bobbed once with difficulty. He wanted to speak, but he couldn't open his mouth, because someone was biting down on his lips. Luo Binghe shut his eyes, his jet-black eyelashes casting curved shadows on his cheeks. It made him look incredibly endearing, but his hands and mouth were a totally different story. He angrily held his hands... I'm too excited. He angrily held... I can't read. He angrily held Shen Qingqiu's lips between his teeth, chomping, the action carrying a hint of childish resentfulness. His right hand released Shen Qingqiu's frozen limb and moved to the center of his waist instead, pressing Shen Qingqiu into his arms. Even though their builds were similar, he could still entirely enfold Shen Qingqiu with this simple, one-armed embrace. Shen Qingqiu's worldview repeatedly collapsed and reformed, cycling infinitely at the speed of light. What broke through his breakdown was a system notification, accompanied by celebratory background music. Satisfaction points, 500. Congratulations, congratulations, congratulations. Important things must be said 3 times. What the fuck? Shen Qingqiu snapped in his head. He finally understood why, even though Luo Binghe hadn't slept with a single girl, even though neither hide nor hair could be seen. Oh yeah, we've got art. Of his innumerable harem of beauties, his satisfaction points had never fallen. Because he'd used Shen Qingqiu to make up for the deficit. Ah. The Shen Qingqiu who'd suddenly understood the truth was half horrified and half enraged. He raised his foot and kicked. Luo Binghe neither ducked nor sidestepped and took the kick head on, but he didn't retreat a single step. He even continued to hold Shen Qingqiu without letting go. "I'm not even allowed to dream?" he asked, looking both angry and wounded. "Hurry and wake up. Even though this is a dream, you didn't dream up this..." Big shot. He couldn't slap Luo Binghe awake, but he couldn't let him continue this foolishness either. This was the real being stuck between a rock and a hard place. Shen Qingqiu hadn't figured out what to yell in order to calm himself down when his back was slammed into a stand of bamboo without warning, and he was pressed into it. Luo Binghe lowered his head and descended once more. It wasn't Shen Qingqiu's first time being kissed, but it was his first time feeling the threat of someone going crazy and biting off his lips. Between disordered breaths, Luo Binghe whispered, "Shizun, I was wrong." Shen Qingqiu managed to free one of his hands and pushed against Luo Binghe's chest. He really didn't want to do this kind of woman from a good family resisting a ruffian pose, but... You fucker, does this look like you knowing that you're in the wrong? Shen Qingqiu was the one who had been wrong. Really wrong. Completely wrong. Wind from an empty cave. Yeah, right. Art. Uh-huh. The light in this one? Like, coming through, the light's coming through. Everything's coming through. We're finally freaking coming through. Okay. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. There was a scientific basis to all that Jianghu gossip. Every single gossiper must have been a fallen angel in their previous life, hence their ability to see past the surface to the reality beneath. Shen Qingqiu hadn't raised the male lead to be an asexual, and it wasn't an issue of whether or not Luo Binghe was a masochist. The reality was much more terrifying. He'd raised the male lead to be gay. Ah. No wonder he hadn't collected a single wife. No wonder his harem was in shambles. Women could no longer attract his interest, and they were no longer linked to his satisfaction points. What the actual fuck? Shen Qingqiu absolutely refused to submit, tenaciously resisting and struggling with all his might. He was just considering which option would result in a worse conclusion, self-detonating again or kicking Luo Binghe's crucial bits when Luo Binghe released him without warning. He looked at the sky above them with its swirling vortex of clouds, and his expression abruptly darkened. In an instant, the scenery and people before Shen Qingqiu's eyes crumbled and dissipated, the illusion shattering into 1,000 pieces. At the same time, on the roof of Huanhua Palace's main hall, Shen Qingqiu sprang to his feet. Now this was the real world. Shen Qingqiu took in a series of violent breaths and finally managed to settle his mind. Suddenly, he realized that every area beneath the main palace had been lit, and the alarm bells were ringing together en masse. He poked his head over the edge, his clothes flapping ceaselessly in the night wind, and looked down from above. Countless lights were converging on the palace. Those were the disciples of Huanhua Palace's various domains, swarming here from all directions. Stand guard. This is an order to all domains. Stand guard. Another breach, someone cursed. How many times has he broken in by now? Have we managed to hold him off even once? Shen Qingqiu rejoiced. An invasion was ideal. It would let him escape in the chaos. Who cared about that heavenly demon blood or whatever? His integrity was more important. Leave first and worry later. Goodbye. But in the end, he hadn't flown 2 steps before he heard someone say, he went in the direction of Huanhua Pavilion. Form up and stop, Luo Binghe. Shen Qingqiu's feet slipped out from under him, and he immediately turned around and ran back. Damn it. Luo Binghe just had to come now. Shen Qingqiu couldn't just throw him to a wholly broken down and presently raging Luo Binghe, right? Huanhua Pavilion was where successive generations of palace masters had lived and cultivated, and it wasn't too far. With a couple of steps, Shen Qingqiu leapt off the roof, mingling with the main unit and hurrying over. They had yet to enter Huanhua Pavilion when wave after wave of frigid, threatening wind assaulted them from head on. From within the structure there came an enraged shout full of murderous intent. Get out! When they'd heard the alarm bells, some ignorant disciples had burst in, and the several dozen people in front were sent flying by an enormously powerful wave of qi. Shen Qingqiu was in the wave after, so he managed to dodge the blow in time. Picking out a good position, he took advantage of the chaos and slipped inside. A freezing chill hit him the moment he entered, eliciting a wave of goosebumps. It was as if the entirety of Huanhua Pavilion had become an enormous ice cave. A single step inside was like entering a land of frost and snow. Chill wind flooded Shenqingqiu's robes and sleeve, and the cold sweat on his back and forehead rapidly froze into a thin layer of ice. One could imagine exactly how inhospitable the interior had to be. Not only was the temperature abnormally low, the doors were all sealed shut, the windows airtight. It was both freezing and dark. If it hadn't been for the intruder, that is, Sangchong Mountain's director of demolitions, Luo Binghe, forcibly blowing open a huge hole in the walls, the place would have been like a coffin made of ice. The top of the sitting platform at the center of the pavilion was half shrouded by curtains, and several black and white outer robes were messily piled beside it. Luo Binghe was only wearing an inner robe, and he looked like he'd just gotten up from bed. His black hair was disheveled, and his clothes were in disarray, the neckline gaping and crooked. Thank you for that image. His face was abnormally pale, yet his lips had color, while his eyes flashed with a cold light, the aura sinister and menacing. It seemed he was prepared to fight, his claws and fangs bared. Luo Binghe faced him from 7 steps away, the bones protruding on his sword-holding hand, his entire face ashen. He stared at Luo Binghe, who calmly sat next to the platform and enunciated each word. "You bastard." That's the end of the chapter. By the way, we're on page 245 for chapter 11, the title of which we'll get to in a second. So MXTX really loves a, for lack of a better term, false first kiss. That seems to be a thing that she enjoys. And I do too. Don't get me wrong. I am absolutely on board with this trope. Are you kidding? Especially if she's gonna, execute it like this. And Modazushi. Technically, no, not in Heaven Official's Blessing. But 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I don't think Heaven Official's Blessing. Somebody added me up a little bit. Oh, yeah, no, I'm indeed very close to just either swallowing the book whole or throwing it out the window. That's immediately to my right. One of the two is most certainly going to happen. She did the dream false kiss reason to rejoice, but not fully. It's, the thing happened, yet not entirely. False pretenses? Misunderstandings surrounding the first, thing? Well, at the same time, now, our boy has finally gotten it. It was gonna take about that much. Was what I figured. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, the Heaven Official's Blessing first was a whole... Yeah, was the underwater deal. Yeah. And now we have Luo Binghe coming in for what, round 3? Somewhere around there? Of fucking course. Page 245 for chapter 11, by the way. The chapter is called Corpse. The last time we had a chapter like that, it was called Death, in which, Shenqingqiu died. So, who knows? Who can say? I'm just... Yeah. What the hell time is it? Oh my god, now would be a good time. A great time, considering I'm almost out of water. Give me just a couple of minutes to go make a cup of tea. Real quick. And come back and we will do chapter 11. Now is a good time to get up and walk around, if you know what I mean. Where did my bookmark go? Oh, it's right here. someone mentioned a thousand autumns. That is, if I remember correctly, that is something that I will definitely be reading on stream. But when I rearranged, I've had to rearrange my reading schedule, and I think Thousand Autumns is not something that's going to happen this year. With everything else that is going on. Thousand Autumns is on the schedule, but the schedule is still pretty long. If it squeaks into the year, it'll be at the end. I know that much. Because there's just a lot of stuff. So, I'm going to go get a cup of tea. Because after that, I need a cup of tea. And I'll be right back, and we will keep going with chapter 11, Corpse. Yeah. Uh-huh. Be right back. Alrighty. Let me get my face out of the way. There we go. I am now armed with tea. Thank you. And we are on, once again, page 245 for chapter 11, which is called Corpse. Which we should be getting through today. So, continuing on in the middle of everything. A violent surge of spiritual light and killing intent burst from Cheng Luan. Shenxing Cho's guard was up as he glanced back and forth between the two. Then suddenly he looked in the direction in which Lu Qingge's sword was pointed. From his brain there came the sound of the last surviving shred of his worldview finally shattering. Luo Binghe's right hand was on Shin Mo, which never left his side, the snow-white blade already almost halfway out of its sheath, yet his left arm was, in fact, holding a person. Though Shenxing Cho called it a person, it was more correct to say a body. It was completely lifeless, its head lolling and limbs slack, yet also completely pliable. It too wore a set of flimsy inner robes, the neckline having slipped past its shoulder, exposing half of a paper-white back. "What have you done?" said Lu Qingge. Lu Qingge would never forget the scene he had witnessed just seconds before. After Cheng Luan had torn open an entrance, he had found a room completely empty other than the overlapping silhouettes among the curtains. Lu Qingge knew that Luo Binghe definitely had to be in the pavilion, but he never could have imagined that he wasn't the only one within. Luo Binghe raised his eyebrows, tugging the limp body in his left arm further into his embrace. "You tell me, what have I done?" Shenxing Cho was thoroughly speechless. Two people, or you should say, one alive person and one dead person, rolling off something similar to a bed together, in clothes that barely covered anything. It didn't look like something family-friendly, whatever way you spun it. Without a single word from Lu Qingge, Cheng Luan shot forward. Shin Mo had yet to be drawn all the way, so using only the sheath, Luo Binghe blocked Cheng Luan's point. The energy from Cheng Luan's sword glares was overwhelming. Shifting sideways slightly, Luo Binghe blocked the bitingly cold energy attacks, keeping the body in his arms safe behind him as his expression grew angry. Lu Qingge, too, had realized that if he deployed Cheng Luan within such a cramped chamber, a bit of carelessness might lead to his razor-sharp sword energy damaging that body. He instantly returned his sword to its sheath and began pitting his spiritual energy against Luo Binghe's. I probably should have said that my first guess was it had something to do with Shenxing Cho's body, but still wouldn't have been like this. As they tumbled around, locked in combat, the loose clothes on that body slipped completely down to its waist, and Luo Binghe's palm pressed flush against that fair skin. "A beast, no matter what, he's still your Shizun," Lu Qingge said with bloodshot eyes. "You think I'd do this with an outsider?" Luo Binghe asked calmly. The Huan Palace disciples who'd formed several circles around them were all dumbstruck. Luo Binghe paid them no attention, his entire focus on dealing with Lu Qingge. Spiritual energy roiled like boiling water in the air around them, shooting in all directions. As they clashed, their expressions worsened, each more frightening than the last. No one dared to step inside Huan Pavilion for fear of being caught in the crossfire. Shenxing Cho, however, wasn't afraid of the crossfire. He was merely unable to look at it straight on. Too hardcore. Way too fucking hardcore. Even if his imagination had been as vast as the moon was covered with craters, he had still never imagined that one day he would become a character in this kind of hardcore kink play. The thing Luo Binghe was holding in his arms, that was indeed dead, right? He absolutely wasn't mistaken, because that was his corpse, okay? This had already surpassed the level of fridge horror. Even before he thought about it carefully, it was already beyond horrifying. Even though he couldn't force himself to look directly, he hadn't forgotten his reason for coming back. Shen Qingqiu flashed behind Lu Qingge. The latter went on guard, believing this to be an ambush, and let out a dark laugh, preparing to send his assailant flying with spiritual qi. However, instead, a hand pressed against Lu Qingge's back, and a stream of steady, gentle, yet powerful spiritual energy flooded into his meridians. Once Lu Qingge received this aid, he could somewhat push back Luo Binghe. Lu Qingge dared not be careless, but he turned his head slightly. Out of the corner of his eye, he could only make out the muddled visage of the person behind him, as if there was something covering their face. "Who's there?" Lu Qingge asked quietly. Shen Qingqiu didn't answer, and instead sent more force through his hand. The two peerlessly powerful streams of spiritual energy merged into one. Though Luo Binghe could block it perfectly, this blast of offensive spiritual energy would travel down his body and into the corpse in his arms. He could dissipate the energy, but the dead could not. If he didn't let go, the shock would probably cause the body's facial apertures to rupture. Luo Binghe was unwilling to harm the corpse, so he could only release it. The body was shortly tossed away by the boiling spiritual field, flying outward. Even after letting go, Luo Binghe's gaze remained firmly fixed on that body, his expression both helpless and reluctant. Shen Qingqiu suddenly found that expression of his unbearable. Using this method to force him to let go somehow felt a bit like bullying. Several disciples lacked sense and moved to take action. "Don't touch him," Luo Binghe yelled. Even from a distance, a wave of his sleeve filled with that direction with screams. Shen Qingqiu withdrew the spiritual energy he'd been applying to Lu Qingge's back. With a tap of his foot, he launched himself forward, catching the body within his arms. The sensation of holding your own corpse definitely wasn't just an ordinary level of incredible. Lines of dialogue. Shen Qingqiu gave it a couple of cursory glances. His old body's complexion was actually still decidedly rosy, its forelimbs pliant. Other than the tightly closed eyes and lack of breath, it was no different from a living person in a deep sleep. After self-detonation, one's spiritual energy was entirely dispersed. No cultivation remained within to prevent the corpse's decay. On top of that, more than 5 years had passed since his death, so just preserving the body with ice wouldn't have yielded this level of success. The body didn't smell of herbs, so it probably hadn't been treated with chemicals either. It was unclear what method Luo Binghe had used. Shen Qingqiu dodged a spiritual blast strong enough to split stone and looked up. Luo Binghe was currently staring dead at him, his expression ferocious. Only now did Shen Qingqiu realize that this body's clothes had already slipped all the way down its torso, and that he was holding its naked flesh. Given how he had been touching and gazing at it, no matter how you looked, it was both incredibly disturbing and rather provocative sight. He hurriedly pulled up the corpse's clothes, then sent this hot potato toward Lu Qingge. "Catch!" Luo Binghe wanted to seize it, but he was intercepted by Shen Qingqiu. Originally, Shen Qingqiu had been worried that Luo Binghe would activate the heavenly demon blood mites, but whether murderous intent had gone to his head or his panic had sent him into a tizzy, he surprisingly didn't think to activate that trump card. Lu Qingge caught the body with one arm and called forth Cheng Luan with his free hand, easily beating back the circle of attacking Huan Palace disciples. Due to being tossed back and forth between them, the corpse's top had finally ripped completely. When Lu Qingge caught it, he felt an expanse of smooth skin beneath his palm, both fine and cool, and the area where his hand touched seemed to skitter with a slight electric current. Lu Qingge's entire body froze. Finding no appropriate place he could hold the body, he almost sent it back once more. Luckily, he managed to resist this impulse in the end and took off his outer robe, the white cloth spreading like wings, and bundled up the body in his arms. Cheng Luan flew back and steadily hovered before his feet. Luo Binghe's eyes had turned fully scarlet. The entire Huan pavilion was like a tightly sealed box, and inside the box a bomb had been placed. When the bomb exploded, the walls collapsed with a loud rumble. Falling alongside the flying sand and hurtling stones, aside from people, and more people, were two objects that hit the ground with a metallic clang. When Shen Qingqiu focused and looked, he saw they were actually two swords. Zhengyang, Shuya. These two swords had originally shared the same fate and broken into numerous sections of blade shards. It was unclear how they had been repaired, but they had been tied together and placed in Huan pavilion. Only with the pavilion's collapse did they once again see the sun and sky. Seeing these two swords once more left an indescribable feeling in Shen Qingqiu's heart. He looked toward Luo Binghe, whose clothes had been disheveled from the start. After that wave of explosions, his clear-cut collarbones and chest lay entirely exposed. Near where his heart lay, there snaked a hideous-looking sword wound. Luo Binghe's ability to regenerate was surpassingly powerful. Even if his limbs were chopped off, he could flawlessly reattach them. If you went a bit more hardcore, he could even grow new ones without problem, unless he purposefully chose not to heal an injury. There were no wounds he couldn't mend, and none that could leave a scar. Lu Qingge, Luo Binghe shouted, for Shizun's sake, I've let you live over and over again, but since you want to die so badly, you can't blame me. The force of his subsequent eruption of spiritual energy and murderous intent almost made Shen Qingqiu's internal organs shift inside him. He knew Luo Binghe was furious, and he hurried to yell at Lu Qingge, "You still haven't left?" It felt like ever since he'd come to this world, he'd kept playing the role of the selfless rearguard who sacrificed himself for others. Lu Qingge gave him a glance, then was as decisive as expected. He left without delay, tucking the body beneath his arm and jumping onto his sword, then flying off at lightning speed. Luo Binghe wanted to take action, but abruptly a violent tremor shook his heart, and Shinmo's sudden recoil forced him still for a beat. Due to this one missed beat, he could only watch helplessly as Lu Qingge flew off with Shen Qingqiu's corpse under his arm. He remained in place in a daze, a blankness flickering over his face for an instant. He'd forgotten to even return fire. He had the appearance of a child who'd had his entire world, his most beloved thing, snatched away from him, whose sky was about to collapse and fall. Shen Qingqiu had originally planned to take advantage of the chaos to slip away, but when he saw this, for some reason his feet remained stuck in place, and that unbearable flash from before grew ever stronger. But even if he found the sight unbearable, it couldn't be helped. If he'd continued to let Luo Binghe embrace that corpse, who knew what gravely sinful and terrifying developments could have transpired? The real problem was that his heart had softened at such an inopportune time. He hadn't managed to slip away. Luo Binghe's head turned sharply in his direction, and those two severe red eyes locked on him. Within its sheath, Shinmo began to tremble with both joy and malice. Luo Binghe's expression clearly told Shen Qingqiu that he would absolutely positively hack him into 1,000 pieces. Shen Qingqiu looked at his eyes that were both furious and devastated and backed up 2 steps. Then all of a sudden, as if his mind had been bewitched, he wanted to tell Luo Binghe something true. He wanted to say, "Don't be so sad, Shizun isn't dead." Just as he moved his lips, a black shadow sprang from the group of Huan Palace disciples. That silhouette was unbelievably fast and nimble. It snatched Shen Qingqiu up like a whirlwind and left just like that. Luo Binghe's eyesight and reflexes were exceptional, yet the spiritual blast he fired managed to miss. He stood in place, emotionally looking at the ruins that remained of Huan Pavilion and at the troops strewn everywhere. The entire time, the Huan Palace disciples had been unable to interfere, but they knew too that Luo Binghe's mental state was unstable after this series of losses. He would definitely explode in a rage. They hurried to kneel en masse. It also happened that Xia Hualing had finally made it to the pavilion. She rushed to the front, but Luo Binghe sent her flying the moment she arrived, and she coughed up 3 liters of blood. That's a lot. She'd long known that Luo Binghe was temperamental, but not knowing what had enraged him this time, she said in terror, "My lord, calm down. My lord, calm down." "The person you brought back is really quite something," said Luo Binghe. This really quite something was so fearsome that it would have been less scary if Luo Binghe had told her to commit suicide on the spot. Xia Hualing's soul almost left her body. "This subordinate has something to report," she said hastily. The moment the break-in occurred, this subordinate detected the problem and went to deal with it. Lu Qingge wasn't the only intruder. The Peak Lord of Baijian Peak had scouted the palace's interior by cover of night, but he was unable to break the maze array. However, someone had broken the maze array beforehand, and using that, Lu Qingge also successfully infiltrated. Luo Binghe gazed in the direction in which Lu Qingge had disappeared on his sword, and slowly clenched his fist, the bones of his knuckles cracking. Sha Hualing figured that Luo Binghe genuinely didn't care who the other intruder was. He was only concerned with Shen Qingqiu's body, which had been snatched away, so she hastily changed her tune. Lu Qingge can't get far carrying that by himself. This subordinate will take some forces and give chase. No need, said Luo Binghe. Sha Hualing shivered, her heart chilly, a vague premonition swelling up within, and indeed she heard Luo Binghe coldly say, I'll go myself. Call Mobe here. That's a scene break. At the bottom of page 253. Well then. At this time, Shen Qingqiu finally came to understand exactly how gentle Luo Binghe had been while controlling the blood mites in his body. If Luo Binghe really wanted to kill someone with heavenly demon blood, the pain would in no way be only on the level of period cramps. He could make you wish you were dead, make it hurt until you couldn't stand straight, couldn't speak, until you could only roll around on the floor, and afterward you'd lie there like a corpse, but the head-to-toe anguish wouldn't lessen even the slightest bit. There was no way you could last until it dulled, or until you got used to it. Case in point. After his rampaging fury passed, Luo Binghe had finally remembered that he still had his heavenly demon blood. The person who dragged Shen Qingqiu off in the midst of the confusion had probably reached someplace safe, and their pace slowed and they began to walk while supporting him. Shen Qingqiu wanted to sit, not walk, but he no longer had the strength to speak. He was dragged along half dead for a stretch before that person finally realized something was wrong. They lowered Shen Qingqiu to the ground. The voice they spoke with was both gentle and refreshing, the words measured. They seemed to be a young man. What's wrong? The young man asked in a concerned tone. Were you injured just now? Shen Qingqiu moved his lips, but he still lacked the strength to speak a single word. At present, it was like millions of blood mites were carousing in his capillaries, biting and swelling, squirming and twisting, the sensation both disgusting and agonizing. This was teaching Shen Qingqiu that when Luo Binghe had activated the blood mites in his body before, he had had no malice at all, and had basically been 120% tender-hearted, more or less just briefly teasing him. Shen Qingqiu rapidly ran through the various achievements and honors he'd earned under the system's coercion, and he honestly found it hilarious beyond belief. Exactly where had he gone wrong? How had his actions resulted in Luo Binghe's feelings of that for him? Shen Qingqiu searched himself and concluded that he'd been a staunch straight man from birth, and that all of heaven and earth could testify to this. There should have been no need to doubt Luo Binghe's orientation either, so exactly whose fault was this? No need to wonder. If a character was derailed, it was, of course, the author's fault. Everything could be blamed on airplanes shooting towards the sky. Two dry laughs had just left Shen Qingqiu when there was another burst of excruciating pain, and he really did roll around on the ground a couple of times. It seemed that doing this could alleviate the agony a little. He'd hardly rolled anywhere when he was held in place by the person who'd taken him. The young man matched Shen Qingqiu's forehead along with his cheeks. His beard had mostly fallen off, leaving it sparse and patchy, and cold sweat was everywhere. That touch trailed downward until it was at Shen Qingqiu's chest and abdomen. For some reason, the places he touched felt a bit better. Shen Qingqiu sucked in a breath, and he couldn't help but say, my friend, where are you touching? Even a few hours ago, he genuinely wouldn't have cared where others, especially those of the same sex, touched him. They could touch wherever they liked. Please go ahead. But ever since Luo Binghe had opened a series of gates to a new world for him, Shen Qingqiu's worldview, which had been set for the past 20-plus years, had suffered a heavy blow. From now on, he needed to look at this world with a new gaze and more sensitive attitude, especially on the issue of befriending those of the same sex. That person made an ah sound, then quickly let go and apologized. Sorry, I didn't mean to. No, said Shenxing Cho. You can touch. Please continue. Thank you. It wasn't an illusion. When this person let go, Shenxing Cho immediately began to hurt. It seemed like this guy really could pacify the heavenly demon blood. Shenxing Cho turned his head. He couldn't see the young man's face clearly beneath the moonlight, but those features were more or less bright and refined, the eyes incredibly pellucid. They reflected Shenxing Cho's silhouette and the crisp moonlight like dew water, the images overlapping within them. Shenxing Cho looked at those eyes and faintly recalled something, but before he could give it careful thought, something exploded within his brain, the pain so great that he groaned. Shoving his head downward, he curled his fingers into a fist and furiously bashed the ground. Suddenly, Shenxing Cho felt someone lift him by the back collar, his lower jaw throbbing as his mouth was forced open and a liquid poured in. His tongue was numb, and from the reaction of the acid in his stomach, though he couldn't tell what taste his liquid had, it probably wasn't anything delicious. Choking, he wanted to spit it out, but the young man covered his mouth. Though his movements were forceful, his tone was incredibly tender. Swallow, he coaxed. Shenxing Cho's throat bobbed violently, and in a moment of haste he ended up swallowing the liquid anyway. Rivulets of the unknown liquid trickled from the corner of his mouth. He lowered his head while coughing harshly, and the young man patted his back from the side, helping him breathe. The shocking thing was that after this liquid entered his mouth and stomach, the pain from the blood mite bites, which had tormented him the entire trip, swiftly vanished. Uh-huh. Okay. Shenxing Cho's body felt better, but the ground dropped out beneath his heart instead. He seized a fistful of the clothing at the young man's chest. What did you make me drink? The young man pried open Shenxing Cho's fingers one by one, bringing them away from his chest, and smiled. Does it still hurt? It didn't hurt. It really didn't hurt. But the fact that it didn't hurt was what made it scary. He never imagined that something like heavenly demon blood could have an antidote. As the sense of taste gradually returned to his tongue, Shenxing Cho felt that the stench of blood within his mouth was also growing stronger, strong to the point that he felt nauseated. The original work had said very distinctly that all medicines were ineffective against heavenly demon blood. Only heavenly demon blood could keep heavenly demon blood in check. Fuck. Not only had he drunk it twice, he'd drunk heavenly demon blood from 2 different owners. Shenxing Cho really could fucking live up to the 8 words, unprecedented and unparalleled, with none before or after. After thinking this, Shenxing Cho let out a cheerful whoop, then fell over face first. Another scene break. The bottom of 258. The sound of ripping flesh. What's more, it was accompanied by hoarse, wretched screams. Shenxing Cho pressed on his temples, and the scene before his eyes slowly clarified and focused. A sea of blood. A mountain of corpses. Luo Binghe stood wooden in the midst of this purgatory of a scene. He wore black, so the blood couldn't mark his clothes, but half of his face was splashed with specks of crimson, and he raised and lowered his sword callously and mechanically. To start, when Shenxing Cho first laid eyes on Luo Binghe, an image automatically surfaced in his mind, that of Luo Binghe holding Shenxing Cho's corpse as he rolled off the bed in a heap. So it was hard to look at him directly. But soon he realized that Luo Binghe was massacring his own dream realm constructions. What difference was there between this and stirring his own brains with a knife? He's not an idiot who doesn't know better. Only a madman would do something like this. Well, I've got news for you. Hello? Oh. But as soon as those eyes reflected Shenching Cho's silhouette, they instantly brightened, and he promptly tossed aside the longsword in his hand. He threw it far, far away, and then hid his blood-stained hands behind him, calling in a quiet voice, "Shizun!" Then he remembered that face was stained too, and as if to remember this, he wiped at the blood washed over half his face with his sleeves. But the more he wiped, the dirtier he became, and like a child who'd been caught stealing red-handed, he grew increasingly distressed. A stranger for the first time, familiar the second. Shenching Cho had experience pretending to be a product of artificial intelligence, and he could still project an unperturbed image. He involuntarily softened his voice when he spoke. "What are you doing?" "Shizun, I'd let you be taken from me again," Luo Binghe said quietly. "This disciple is useless and couldn't even hold on to your body." This answer made Shenching Cho's questions, expression, and emotions became quite equally complicated. Wow, that was a sentence. Let's try that one again. This answer made Shenching Cho's expression and emotions that's why. There's a typo. That's why. Become equally complicated, not became. So this cruel murder of his own dream realm constructions just now should be considered self-discipline? Given how deft Luo Binghe's actions had been, Shenching Cho feared this wasn't the first time Luo Binghe had done this. No wonder Luo Binghe had been unable to distinguish the difference between a product of the dream realm and an intruder from the outside the last time they met. Shenching Cho sighed and deliberated for a while before gently comforting him. "What's lost is lost. I don't blame you." Luo Binghe stared at him vacantly. "But that's all I have left now." Shenching Cho suddenly didn't dare look him in the eye. Could Luo Binghe really have spent those 5 years clinging to a corpse, to an empty shell Shenching Cho hadn't wanted anymore? Luo Binghe's voice abruptly chilled. "After Huayue City, I swore that in this life, I'd never let Shizun be taken from me again. But I still let someone else snatch you away." The bitterness, along with the dark red color within his eyes, was both turbulent and deep-set. The long sword he'd tossed aside soared into the air on his command and pierced through the chests of several people who were on the ground in their death throes. Waves of wretched screaming filled his ears. Shenching Cho hastily restrained him. "Don't be reckless," he reprimanded. "Even if you're dreaming, this is no different from self-harm. Don't tell me you've forgotten." Of course Luo Binghe wouldn't have forgotten. He stared straight back at Shenching Cho, flipping his hand over and pressing it over the back of his old master's. Only after a long while did he say, "I know that I'm dreaming. Only in a dream world would Shizun scold me like this." Upon hearing this line, Shenching Cho snapped back to his senses. He couldn't. This was wrong. He couldn't do this to Luo Binghe. If you didn't have that kind of intention towards someone, you shouldn't give them hope. The larger the hope, the larger the disappointment. His confused state of mind would only continue, and it would increase the chance that he would lose all reason. Even if this was a dream, he still couldn't drag his feet and pussy around like this. He had to be decisive. If he continued to indulge such ill-defined involvement, it would become an evil deed. Shenching Cho firmly yanked his hand back and corrected his expression, adopting that which he was best at, an unapproachable countenance, austere and aloof. Then he turned right around and left. Upon being shaken off, Luo Binghe was stunned for a moment, then dashed after him. "Shizun, I know I was wrong." "If you know you're wrong, don't follow," Shenching Cho said coldly. "I've regretted it for a long while, but I was never able to tell you," Luo Binghe said anxiously. "Are you still angry that I drove you to self-detonate your spiritual energy? I've already fully repaired the meridians in Shizun's body. I'm not lying either. As long as I can enter the holy mausoleum, I'll definitely find a way to awaken you again." Hang on, just one second. I'll be right back. Ah! I'm okay. It's fine. All right. Just a lot. Just so much. Had to release some of that real quick. Shenxing Cho didn't answer, hesitating over whether he should drop some harsh words to make Luo Binghe give up on this idea. But then Luo Binghe suddenly threw himself forward and embraced him from behind. He hugged Shenxing Cho firmly, not budging an inch, even if Shenxing Cho were to thrash and flail like a madman. Shenxing Cho's entire body stiffened within the hug as if he had brushed up against some hairy thing, and the fine hairs on his body stood straight up. He gathered energy into his hand, but still didn't truly attack, instead spitting 2 words between gritted teeth. Beat it. It's supposed to be a guarantee that after blackening, Luo Binghe no longer goes down the route of misery. Take your hands off. Luo Binghe turned a deaf ear to his demand. Or is Shizun angry about what happened in Jinlan City? Correct, said Shenxing Cho. Luo Binghe still refused to let go. When I first returned from the Endless Abyss, I learned that Shizun had told everyone else that I was killed by demons, he mumbled. At first I thought it was because Shizun was kind-hearted, that you still had some lingering sentiments and were unwilling to ruin my name, but after we met, I saw Shizun's attitude, and became scared that I'd been too optimistic. I thought that Shizun hadn't concealed the truth from me, because he felt that having brought up a demon would ruin his reputation. He cut a pitiful figure while speaking, the sentences tumbling out one after another, as if he were terrified that Shenxing Cho would brusquely interrupt and not let him continue. I really wasn't the one who arranged for the sowers. At that time, I was so angry I couldn't think. That's the only reason I let them shut Shizun in the water prison. I've known I was wrong for a long time now. There would probably never be a time where Luo Binghe in reality could ramble non-stop without caring for his image. In all likelihood, he would only dare prattle on like this within the dreams he created for himself. To push him away during this moment would be like giving a young maiden, one who'd finally worked up the courage to call and broken-heartedly weep to an older sister for comfort and encouragement, a face-turning slap. It was really a bit cruel. Shenxing Cho was filled with both deep compassion, as well as a feeling that this was extremely absurd. What could be more absurd than discovering that the person from whom you'd exhaustively plotted to flee, and had indeed fled from for so many years, hadn't actually wanted to kill you at all, but wanted to do you instead? Though whether the desire was to kill or to fuck, the result was the same. Shenxing Cho would still run away with all his might. One party wanted to meet but couldn't, and so had clung to a corpse for 5 years. The other party avoided the first like the plague, but still felt like he had ran into him a great deal. Shenxing Cho's hands were stiff as he raised and lowered them, clenched them and relaxed. In the end, he let out a sigh anyway, and patted that head above his. Fuck, I've really lost, he thought. Right now, forget about the harem. A perfectly fine, dark, and vicious stallion novel male lead was very possibly still a virgin. Luo Binghe had already put himself in such a state, so it would have been rather inhumane of Shenxing Cho to shove another knife in. In the end, Shenxing Cho lost to the deeply tragic act Luo Binghe had sold him, as well as to his own sense of sympathy. Luo Binghe instantly clutched that hand of his. Shenxing Cho felt that the skin on Luo Binghe's palm, which was pressing into the back of his hand, was uneven. When he looked closer, he realized it was a sword scar. At first, Shenxing Cho didn't understand why there were so many scars on Luo Binghe's body, but then he suddenly remembered. During their night encounter in Jinlan City, for a stretch, Luo Binghe had played cat and mouse with him. When Shenxing Cho was caught, he had stabbed at Luo Binghe, and Luo Binghe had caught Shuya's blade point squarely in his hand. As for the wound on his chest and close to his heart, Shenxing Cho had even less of an excuse for forgetting that. It was from the Immortal Alliance Conference. While forcing Luo Binghe to fall, Shenxing Cho had accidentally stabbed him. It seemed like every time he tried to stab Luo Binghe, the latter had never avoided the strike and had instead always received it head-on, neither dodging nor evading, letting him hack away. Because of this, Shenxing Cho had stabbed him twice, despite not wishing to, either time. Furthermore, after being pierced by his blade, Luo Binghe hadn't healed either wound, and instead had purposefully preserved them. Only a short while ago, Shen Qingqiu could have matter-of-factly believed that Luo Binghe was nursing a grudge and keeping the scars to remind himself of his hatred at any time. But now Shen Qingqiu could no longer deceive himself about the exact meaning of these actions. He'd finished reading the hugely long original novel and raised this child to adulthood, but he'd never realized that Luo Binghe was actually a pure-hearted young man. And as the deeply emotional stallion had turned gay, the stallion part had actually been summarily dropped. This Luo Binghe, who'd been bent to heaven knows where by his rearing, possessed a heart both masochistic and easy to harm, more delicate than a young maiden's. Or maybe it wasn't that Shen Qingqiu had never realized it, but that he never thought to understand. When all was said and done, he had still regarded Luo Binghe as a character in a novel, and adopted an attitude that he was something to constantly observe and occasionally mess around with. Most of the time, he'd kept himself at a respectful distance, and Luo Binghe, who'd had the strongest presence in the original work, had ended up suffering most of Shen Qingqiu's assumptions about tropes and story formulas. Faced with this true Luo Binghe, Shen Qingqiu felt it was all extraordinarily troublesome, and he truly was at a loss for what to do. He was still racking his brain for solutions, so from his angle, he couldn't see the hint of a twisted smile lifting the corner of Luo Binghe's mouth. It's the end of the chapter. It's the end of the chapter. That's the end of a chapter. We are on page 265 for chapter 12, My Lucky Number, which is called Juji. And that's where we pick up on Friday. We have, hang on. A little under 40 pages for Friday. So we'll probably finish early, whereas we ran a couple of minutes late today. I suppose, in a rather twisted way, I am somewhat grateful for the chapter break coming there, because a bitch needs to process. A bitch needs 2 business days, please, to think about things that happened. Those things happened. A lot of things happened. And I'm going to go make sure that that's processed. Processing. A lot of processing. So that's what my goal for the next couple of days is. Before we finish Volume 2, where, I can't do it. I need to process first. It's fine. I'm going to go because it's after 5. I hope you had a time, because I certainly did. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I love you very much. I love you so much. Please take care of yourself. And I will see you in 2 business days when we pick this up again. Okay? Great. I will see you then. Bye, guys.